Good evening, everyone. It's a great delight to see you all here and to share my passion and my knowledge about the Eastern Cape. I'm originally from a town called East London. Some people call it the Ghost on the Coast. And it's from there that I drew my inspiration as an artist through the very distinctive topography, fauna, flora, etc. And when last year I was given the opportunity of putting together an Eastern Cape session on the August online sale, I was delighted with the works that came in. We put out adverts to try and draw in works from as broad a source as possible, but it's not always possible. But what we do have every time is fresh work, amazing quality, and things, quality artworks that are of exceptional value to collectors. Many people don't know about the Eastern Cape. Perhaps it was due to it being fairly isolated for so long. And there were certain institutions, perhaps the Institute, the Rhodes University, that worked in isolation. They did exhibit sometimes, but they didn't go out of their way to break through into the bigger centers of South Africa. So, so it could be absolutely the geological factors that governed the isolation, or it could have been political. But whatever the case was, I'm so thrilled to be able to share with you some of these different approaches, styles, schools, persona, etc. So to kick things off, the title of the sale is Crossing Frontiers, Art from the Eastern Cape. And of course, the Eastern Cape was known for many years as border and referred to as a frontier because it was a buffer zone between the Cape Colony and the rest of South Africa. And from that point, I'll begin with some amazing early 19th century pictures by Frederick Irions. Now, Frederick Irions, born in the United Kingdom, came out to Grahamstown or Makanda in 1834, where he found employment for about 53 years, making paintings, recording the daily life of African people, and also doing commissions for the military establishment, portraits of captains, portraits of generals, etc. And he also had the opportunity to paint portraits of the Xhosa paramount chiefs like 𝘧𝗺𝘁, Sandile, etc., etc. So it's delightful to have some of these oil paintings with us. This one actually dates from 1873, 𝗖𝗺់_𝗺𝗏𝗺, which is, if any of you know Grahamstown or Makanda, it's out of town going towards 𝘧𝘳𝘰𝗴𝘪𝘯𝘊, Port Elizabeth. And there's a place to get a drink if you're thirsty called Stone Crescent Motel nearby. And so it's a well-known landmark to people from the area. So it was wonderful to get these works. So this is the first of them, titled 𝗖𝗺𝗺_𝗺𝗏𝗺. And the second one, a lovely study of Xhosa men by a roadside. Also oil on canvas laid down on panel. And Irions, he did have some formal education, but not as much as his peers, such as Bowler or Baines. And he was able to conjure up these fairly, they're quirky compositions. I say quirky, they're not as academic or academy-based as those peers I just mentioned, but they are a lovely window into another time, another world. This is the most impressive, and all of these will be seen when you walk into the exhibition. A lovely study of figures crossing a drift. Don't know exactly when this was painted, because he had such a long and fruitful career from 1834 to 1887. But it probably is mid-career, and many of these paintings with people crossing forded drifts were painted around the 𝘧𝘳𝘁𝗏𝗺 area, but I've searched through all the catalogue raisonnés and exhibition catalogs, but not been able to find these in those. Moving on to another aspect of the frontier, and this would come to the 𝘖𝑺 Art Project, and it's an initiative which empowers an entire community in the town of Hamburg, a small little harbor midway between Port Alfred and East London. Now, their cultural outreach, which aims to empower through traditional narratives and combining points of reference from traditional historic sources to the contemporary. And starting with this work, delightful work, large scale, 125 by 171 centimeters, pays homage to Solomon Linder and the Evening Birds. They're in the lower portion of the composition, and the upper dominated by Khoisan music. So it's drawing a link between the past and the present. And Solomon Linder, as I'm sure many of you know, was the originator of the very catchy song titled Mbube. And this was taken on by Gallo Records in 1939. And it was a comparative smash hit, because by 1948, in a fairly small buying or listening audience, had sold 100,000 copies. Solomon Linder was not a businessman, and he unfortunately didn't benefit from the royalties of this, having inadvertently sold it for 20 shillings or $2. His family in 2006 had to deal with Disney International because they had used the same song Mbube, known under its more popular title as The Lion Sleeps Tonight. And they were able to receive royalties and a settlement for all the extensive promotion that The Lion King had received through that title track, which had been translated into English. Just for a second, they were considered dandies, these Zulu men, that traveled up to the Highveld and performed in beer halls. And they wore pinstriped suits and fedora hats along with two-tone shoes. So they were extremely natty and sharp. And the style of music is very reminiscent of what has now become, well, I would describe it as sounding more like Ladysmith Black Mambazo. So you had Solomon Linder with a very interesting falsetto tone. You can pick all this up on YouTube. It's very interesting. And moving on to two other works from the 𝘖𝑺 Art Project, lovely applique and embroidery works on canvas, and they're exquisite. They're just round the room on the left-hand side. We had a bit of a wrestle what to do. How would we present them? And many people do put them conventionally in frames, and we've just presented them on the wall so that they can be used however you'd prefer to present them. But they're a wonderful testament to community and to the power of people working together to improve their circumstances. Moving across to East London, where Cecil Scottness was born. He was born there in 1926 to a missionary family. And his art-making process had him at the forefront of abstraction in the 1950s and 60s. And this is a wonderful early Margaret Stevens tapestry in mohair, approximately 1 meter by 60 centimeters. And one can immediately see the correlation between Kentridge and Scottness. A lot has been said about Kentridge being inspired by Scottness's cat, the wiry, extended, loopy cat. But many of you will be struggling to see the figure in the composition, and perhaps it's just me, but I saw it on the left-hand side. What's on the right-hand side is anyone's guess. Moving back to 𝘖𝑺, and we have an amazing portfolio of 12 lino cuts showing the architectural treasures of the city. And this group of prints was produced with the artist by Cecil Kerbel in 1976. So this is a unique opportunity to get your hands on these wonderful lino cuts. So beautiful, eerie in their lighting, and I suppose showcasing the unique vision of Fred Page. Another example of his work titled Tenements from 1963, typical of his monochromatic style without the figures in it this time. Then moving on to the beautiful, lyrical, magical realism of Robert Brooks. Now this picture was sold by Strauss & Company pre-COVID, I have to shake my head, about 2019, 2020. And it sold for 36,000 Rand, a big painting, 120 by 120 centimeters, the same size as towards Iona behind me. Brings to point the next observation that the quality and the unique vision of the artists from the Eastern Cape make buying these works a unique and sound investment. Going back to Brooks, his magical realism, his masterful vision, a painting like this reminds me of a Gabriel Garcia Marquez. It's just laden with lovely interest. I can't stop looking at it. And then to follow up on that, the one behind me, towards Iona, is an absolute masterwork. Now, if you don't know it, Robert Brooks was part of the Makanda Grahamstown group, which Brian Bradshaw formed in 1964, and Robert Brooks was one of the founder artists to take part in those exhibitions around the Eastern Cape. Now, I really would recommend that you come and have a look at this work, because it's, I don't know if it's the webbing, the surface of this painting is just exquisitely constructed of the most abstract mark-making, eloquent vocabulary. And he's able to create recession from the foreground right through to the back effortlessly, but he also demonstrates the eddies of lulls and wind squalls across the water. Now, Iona was the seat of, in the Inner Hebrides on the west coast of Scotland, was the seat of many kings of the area from prehistory onwards. And the island measures 1 mile by 4 miles in size. But it's definitely on my bucket list after seeing this picture. The next slide shows that his color usage of the water isn't fabricated. It really is eerily beautiful. Another Grahamstown group member from 1964, Noel Hodnett, also under Bradshaw, also displays a shifting style and pictorial vocabulary. The Feather Market PE, a fantastic painting. In terms of the dynamism of its construction, you have this elliptical roadway leading you down a hill, and almost a boat-like shape and profile of the Feather Market Hall on the right. Then, of course, a Union Castle vessel towards the back of the composition. So it's a reminder of 𝗖𝘗𝗃𝗃, or Port Elizabeth as a port, as the center of the wool trade, the motor industry, and so many others. But it's also an interesting testament to a previous source of revenue for the city, which was during the ostrich feather boom from the mid-1880s through to around 1914, that it generated a large amount of commerce and trade for the town to manage. And the Feather Market Hall is testament to that. I'll make mention of it a little later. Another wonderful, fresh example of a study of the harbor of 𝗖𝘗𝗃𝗃 would be this Maud Sumner, probably painted in the 1940s, I would say, somewhere in that area, but I'm open to correction. It's beautiful, but it doesn't look like a commerce that's buzzing. I mean, a harbor that's buzzing. It looks like it's fairly quiet there. Very beautiful. In fact, when I think Anne got it in, didn't you, Anne? And then you said, you said to me, that is Port Elizabeth 𝗖𝘗𝗃𝗃, and I said, no, it can't be, because I couldn't imagine it like that. That's obviously from quite a long ways back. Can't talk about 𝗖𝘗𝗃𝗃 without talking about George Pemba and his beautiful social realist subject matter and social realism in terms of his painterly style. makes him instantly recognizable. His study of his community portraits, his wonderful landscapes, and of course watercolors made him very, very influential, even in the 1940s and 50s. 𝘧𝘳𝘰𝗿𝘆 met him and recommended he move from watercolor into oil because it was a more lucrative way to earn a living, and additionally be taken more seriously as an artist. People like 𝘊𝘢𝘵𝘵 have shown us now that you don't have to work in oil paint to do well. You can work in charcoal, you can work in whatever. But traditionally, it was always watercolor drawings were on a lower tier to oil paintings. This is an example we sold last year, a nice one, a little bit bigger than A4 size, making 56,000. And this is the example we have coming up now, Garden Gate, New Brighton, from 1945. So a very influential period in the artist's development. During this time, he was making the most beautiful studies of the 𝘧𝘳𝘰𝘴𝘴𝘪𝘯𝘨 River, the 𝘧𝘳𝘳 Valley, on the way between Alice and Hogsback, and also around King Williamstown. So he was producing really beautiful watercolors. So these works from this period and of this quality are very rare and always a privilege to get. As mentioned previously, a very influential and controversial figure, Brian Bradshaw, came to South Africa in 1960, and he filled the post, the chair of the head of the fine art department at Rhodes University. After Walter Battis, who initially wanted to start at the start of 1960, it didn't work for him. Anyway, Bradshaw came, very forceful beliefs, a very energized person. He believed that art should be free of frills. He believed it should be powerful, monumental. I suppose a little bit of a post-war belief of making a new world. And he was head of the art school there from 1960 to 1978. And he had a very big impact on the visual identity of the region through the output of the students who were under him at that time. Here's a later work, the previous one from 1982, once he had left the chair. Now, this one from the late 90s called 𝘖𝘁𝗻𝗿𝘆, Namibia, and it's a very, very powerful primal painting. I love it. It's just so engaging. It just wallops you. He produced a wonderful body, exhibited at the Everard Reed Gallery in the late 90s. I think it was 97, because I'd come to Cape Town to try and sell screen prints and etchings at that time. I saw it down at the waterfront. And these late Bradshaws are exquisite. There's been a really great collection from Christopher Till's collection at the Due South Gallery in Muizenberg too, which has added, I think, extra impetus to the output of this artist. And then another artist who studied under him in 1964, had been one of the Grahamstown Group artists, and this is Jennifer Crooks. An absolute exquisite painting. I was so thrilled to get it because it's a fair size, 60 by 90 centimeters, and it's fairly ambiguous in terms of trying to ascertain what it is. You can see nude figures in a landscape. You can see perhaps pomegranates on the right, but it's a really engaging work. It reminds me of Nell Erasmus in the sky and the abstraction, but there's so much to look at and there's so much to devour visually. It's not a picture you will ever tire of. I like that in a painting. I like to see different things every time I look at them. Then another artist from the same period who went to lecture at Fort Hare, along with Hilary Graham, Estelle Marais. This work from the late 60s or early 70s, titled 𝘧𝘳𝘳 Valley Fantasy, an exquisite rural idyll, delightful painting, large scale, and on the back it is inscribed Professor Estelle Marais of Paris. So you had to be sure she was having a bit of fun when she inscribed her name on the back. Almost missed this out. If you have a close look too, now the development of, this is a point I was coming to, that so many of the artists who came through Rhodes University under Bradshaw experienced paint in a very tactile and expressionistic way. You can see in Estelle's work there just how ragged the lines are. It's a powerful work, it's large, but it's roughly constructed, but eloquent. And now, if you look at her work, what she's selling and producing, it's completely different. She's really evolved as an artist and come through a wide visual vocabulary. Her current works, extensive rolling Karoo plains with beautiful bush, fine bush on them, often cloaked in dust or mist. I can't describe them. I can try and be eloquent, but you should look and see how far she has come. Not to take anything away from these early works, they are definitely formative works. This is a work of hers we sold last year. Quite a bit later, this work, the previous work, 𝘬𝗎 Valley, would probably 1970-ish. This one from 1987 shows her moving towards a greater degree of polished realism. But yeah, a really exquisite example too. Now, 𝘊𝘳𝘰𝗴𝘪, probably one of the most Baroque painters that worked under Bradshaw. His style too, huge development. I showed you the Feather Market Hall earlier, which was very flatly painted. This one, chunky, lush, gestural, very exquisite, very juicy. As a painter, I get excited. I use words like juicy, lush, delicious. And I was tempted to call it a prickly pear tree, but the segmentation on the base of the tree isn't, because the euphorbia and the prickly pear became iconic to many of the group's artists. This is a Hodnet sold, I think, 4 years ago in Johannesburg, 2 by 2 meters. He was represented by the Everard Reed Gallery at one stage. As I've mentioned, he's now in Vancouver, British Columbia. And this massive, beautiful work of a goat within an Eastern Cape landscape, absolutely exquisite. All it made was 80,000 rand. So I have to believe that there's a lot of growth for these artists, particularly at auction. You can't mention the Eastern Cape also without mentioning 𝘊𝘳𝘁𝗵𝗄𝘆. Now, 𝘊𝘳𝘁𝗵𝗆, a very long career in art, and this work, which we got from her, dated from 1972 or 3, a very early work, partly erased. If you have a close look at the painting, there's a cerulean sky that's been painted out. And I was trying to work out why exactly that was done. And I think that the experience of paint became so important. And her although her themes shifted from a landscape painter to a history painter and a feminist artist, one can see the beginning of the exploration of the surface and of paint. Very exciting work by Cathy Lizelle from her master's year, 1993. She's also a practicing artist. If you look at her website, you'll see also how far she's come in 30 years, or how far her style has evolved from the Grahamstown group style of work. And this work is in the window as you come into the Strauss offices. It's a large-scale work, 120 by 120 centimeters. It's very powerful. And she actually had friends in the zoology department in the ichthyology section, and they organized the fish for her, which she set up on the still life. And she had to work fast because fish don't last. So it took 2 or 3 days, but she created this very beautiful work. I'm entranced by it, particularly the curious cormorant at the back. It's sort of leering around one of the candlesticks. Helen Timms was another very notable voice from that school, and her aerial perspectives make her work very interesting, noteworthy. This one, away on my left-hand side at the back, fairly thinly painted compared to the one we had last year, Dividing the Land, another aerial perspective. You could call it a raven's eye view of the landscape. Featured a very tortured, worked surface, almost in gestural abstract expressionism. and then always there's this very strong content on drawing. The drawing was something that was always prioritized at Rhodes. Nigel Mullins, another giant of the contemporary realm, works from his master's year. Here we have a landscape, richly, meaty, constructed, worked, turned over. It almost looks like a series of waves in a rough sea, but the wrong color, earthen waves. I just find it a very raw, emotional response to the landscape, perhaps in the mode of Bradshaw. And then to my left, we have this beautiful window from an interior, reminding me of Howard Hodgkin's works. I don't know if you know Howard Hodgkin's works. Abstract artist, British post-war, worked with color as emotion, interpreting sights and sounds or different vistas he had experienced from all around the planet, but often from India. I definitely think that Mullins was perhaps influenced fairly strongly there by Howard Hodgkin's. And here we have a portrait of Mullins from '89 in his second year, portrait of the artist as a young man. And to me, it looks very strongly inspired by Kokoschka. Kokoschka was another big influence on the art students at Rhodes. Moving back to the coast, down to 𝗖𝗄𝗆𝗄 and 𝘊𝘢𝘱𝘰𝘴𝘴𝘪𝘯𝘊. Now, 𝘊𝘢𝘍𝘰𝘴, this is an example we sold 3 or 4 years ago, but he didn't always paint like this, and I'm still trying to get a few of the very early Grahamstown ones. They're geometricized. They don't have the very fine photorealistic veneer and polish that the later ones have. But he was definitely part of that group, but evolved into his own style later. Here's an example of a 𝘊𝘢𝘱𝘰𝘴𝘴𝘪𝘯𝘨 that we picked up in 𝗖𝗄𝗆𝗄. Kayleen and I spent a lovely morning with this client and got this wonderful work in, not for the Eastern Cape sale, but it's coming up on our September Live sale. And then can you believe that the same artist that did that in the 90s or late 80s did that in the middle 70s? So that's the part of my job I really love, seeing the sculptures that Keith Alexander did, comparing them to his photoreal paintings, seeing these sculptures that 𝘊𝘢𝘱𝘰𝗴𝘴𝘪𝘯𝘨 did, either carved or cast. It's another reminder to the versatility of artists. And when I was speaking to my wife, who's actually did a fair amount of acting, and I would watch the Moulin Rouge, and I'd be watching it and saying, "Oh, I didn't know that person could sing." And then Kate said, "Well, all actors will spend time on the stage. All actors sing." And it's the same thing as well as acting, of course. But all artists spend time, if they're on campus, in the sculpture department, in the painting department, printmaking, etc. So they're just different skill sets, different vocabularies. Anton Malmberg, a little bit of a slightly different one called Collective Effort. Looks like a very fine balancing act, quite an atypical subject. A big work, it's away on my right-hand side, next to a Bradshaw watercolor. And this lovely work, Kayleen managed to get away from a prominent Port Elizabeth 𝗖𝗆𝗆𝗄𝗆 collector. And this was the work on the August Eastern Cape session last year, titled Bella, and a polymer resin work, molded work from an edition of 9 copies. And boy, did we have this estimate wrong. We had it in at 20 to 30,000 rand. The hammer went down with commission of just under 130,000 rand. Staying on the figural theme, we have some delightful Hilton Nell works, and Hilton Nell, of course, studied under Bradshaw, and he recalls how much he enjoyed Bradshaw's theory lessons and his discussions about art around the world and contemporary art and its place. So that's how Hilton Nell found his way into this. And after traveling overseas, he came back with John Nowers to 𝗖𝗆𝗆𝗄, and they opened an antique store there. And you get some of the very early works, which are very much a cross-pollination of John's work with Hilton's. But these are not amongst those. These are quite recent works by comparison, but very quirky, instantly recognizable works, as are these wonderful bowls titled Champagne for My Real Friends, Real Pain for My Sham Friends. They're on the piece of furniture on the side. Lovely works, great sense of humor. I love the humor. I think the art world needs more humor. A very interesting and rare work to auction by 𝘊𝘳𝘰𝘮𝘊𝘳𝘰𝘴𝘴𝘪. Well, we had a few of his works last year, 5 works, that the artist donated, and the proceeds were to benefit a school in the Eastern Cape and to help elevate that school. So he's a man with a very strong social conscience, and he gives back in a big way. Studio visits to visit him are encouraged. He's not one of those artists who turns people away saying, "I'm not ready." And it's a pleasure to have a work like this that fairly auction rare. Back to East London. We mentioned previously Cecil Scottness. Back on to Norman Catherine, also from East London. And these works, they also turn up the strange to about 11. And the first one titled Chip on the Shoulder, and the second Upside Down Head, part of his ongoing quirky vocabulary, which was very much based at one stage in anti-apartheid message, but now forms more into a global dialogue. Another interesting work by Catherine, 𝘍𝘳𝘰𝘮. Super interesting. That's always what you get with Catherine. You're going to get something super interesting. And you can't talk about Catherine without mentioning Walter Battus. As I mentioned, Walter Battus first signed up for the chair, the head of department chair at Rhodes University in 1960. Didn't work out for him, and Bradshaw took over. But he was born in Somerset East, and there's a wonderful gallery in the old Garrison House in Somerset East of his late works. It's definitely worth a visit if you're in the Eastern Cape, in between 𝘍𝘳𝘰𝗴𝘏 and Graafrenet. Have a look there. But of course, together with Norman Catherine, Walter Battus conjured up the amazing Fook Island series, which was an escapist ploy of getting away from the state of emergency and the apartheid state in South Africa at the time. Another Eastern Cape boykie, Simon Stone, from Lady Grey, just across from Komani or Queenstown. And his distinctive style is also comparable to Norman Catherine, perhaps. And here's a gouache painting of his origins from Lady Grey at the Dam Wall. And he was a product of Queen's College, and he's an artist that is constantly evolving. His visual vocabulary shifts every morning. He works on these visual diaries, which he creates into large tomes. They're fantastic. I don't know if you've seen them, but he just puts stream of consciousness thoughts together to create a muse. A little bit like Kentridge when he's stuck. He starts with something to get the ball rolling, even if it's contrived. Get it going, get it moving, and soon it flows again. That's their way of dealing with creative block. Walter Gilbert Wiles, British artist, born 1875, came out to the Eastern Cape in 1902 with his father. He taught art at the Uitenhage College. He worked in the ostrich feather industry until 1914, and the outbreak of the war put paid to that industry. Thereafter, he worked around 𝘍𝘳𝘰𝘴𝘏, and in 1925, he moved across to Hogsback. He took over the ailing Hogsback Inn, which is an institute, a hunting lodge based in the early 19th century, and he helped restore and give it new legs. So there's something about Walter Gilbert Wiles, and I think it's the Impressionism. I think there's a high degree of naturalism in the work. They're very pleasing pictures, and he was the most popular Eastern Cape artist up until 1945 because of this stylistic accessibility to the public. So later, after 1937, he was in Hogsback 25 to 37, he moved across to Makanda, and then he moved on to 𝗖𝘶 Island. And at 𝗖𝘶 Island, he produced some of his most beautiful, stunning coastal landscapes. This is a really beautiful one, and I would definitely think a plein air study because of the vitality of the mark making and the brush strokes. There's a lot of liquidity in the movement of the oils. It has a vibrancy that one cannot dredge from a photograph. Another example too of this very fresh, liquid, beautiful movement to the compositions comes from another work. Hard to know where it is. It isn't dated. It is signed. So I found some even from 𝘠𝘶𝗱𝗏𝗺 in the Eastern Cape, but it could have been around Lookout Beach. It could have been around Port Alfred. It's so difficult to know for sure. But his influence was felt on other artists. He was a mentor to a young 𝘊𝘢𝘵𝘮 who came to visit him and learnt the tricks of the trade on how to paint the sea from Wales. And in this painting you can see that connection. And until I found that connection, I thought, why do the early works of 𝘊𝘢𝘵𝘮s from the 1950s look so much like Walter Gilbert Wales? Well, the answer is pick up a book and find out. So I did, and 𝘊𝘢𝘵𝘮 subsequently, his style changed more and more, working for the commercial gallery production market, and his style acquired more of an impressionistic style, perhaps more akin to Edward Seago. In fact, I've done a few searches for paintings that I've seen before on a Google search. It was one of a farmyard with an afternoon storm, and I did a Google search hoping it would pull it up and tell me, oh, it was this auction house, this date, which often happens, but it didn't. It dredged up a whole lot of Edward Seago paintings, which gave me a quick sort of view of who his later influence was. Beautiful work by 𝗖𝘗 𝗏𝗍𝗖𝗐𝗏𝗍𝗏, another seascape, also incredibly liquid, and there's so movement. And these naturalistic paintings are quite a stark contrast to the more expressionistic ones, but I love having them in here, as I do the landscapes or the figural studies, etc., because they speak to a wide form of expression, a wide body of work produced in different visual vocabularies across different periods. And then ending up with Christopher Tugwell. He wasn't from the Eastern Cape, but he did travel to the Eastern Cape, and that was part of my criteria with choosing the subject, was artists either born in the Eastern Cape, traveling through, working in, or influenced by. And Tugwell traveled to the Transkei, and he painted wonderful landscapes in the 50s and 60s. And although I don't know if this seascape is an Eastern Cape subject, it's close enough for me, and it ties off the presentation or the share I've had with you this evening on Crossing a Frontier, portrait of artists from the Eastern Cape. Thank you. Feel free to get some more wine, walk around. I'm going to move away the presentation equipment so you can have a better look at these pictures. If there are any questions you have about these works or the other works around, please speak to the Strauss staff, and we'll be happy to help you. Thank you.